Hey, George, you're a scientist.
I'm a chemist, yes.
Right, you're a scientist. Why can't more types of plastic be recycled? And I specifically mean, like, is there a scientific problem? Because I know there's an economics one, because a lot of economics stuff about, like, climate change and environmentalism is about the economics of plastic recycling and plastic as an industry and all that. But I never hear anyone just say it straight up like, our science has not advanced. Like, why can't I recycle more plastic?
Darn it, Lions, I'm an environmental chemist, not a organic polymerization chemist. But interestingly, this is almost a chemistry question.
Yay, we got one.
not in my direct expertise, but with my very limited expertise and very limited knowledge, I will attempt to opine to this problem. So let's start off with, what are plastics? Do you know what plastics are?
I know it is a category of thing, because I always have to second guess myself when someone says a sentence like you just said, like plastics, like, oh, what do you do for a living? I'm in plastics, right? Or like in the 40s or 50s, someone might have said like, oh, we have to invest. There's going to be a huge future in plastics, right? So I know it is not one thing. It is like a category of thing. Mm-hmm. I know most plastics are made from oil, like, or part of that process of like refining oil. But I know we can also make plastics out of other stuff. So I assume it has something to do with like a bunch of crazy like carbon bonds. Like we take some kind of raw crap that has the atoms in it we need, and then arranging them a certain way is what makes it into plastic.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, you are very directionally correct.
Banging, I'll take it.
So plastics are polymers, right? So those two things could be used synonymously or interchangeably, you know? So what they do with plastics is they take typically a very small organic molecule, right? So it is always organic, or at least always organic to my knowledge. I can't imagine what that'd look like if it was inorganic.
It's a metal plastic.
Yeah. Wait a minute. No, something I just said doesn't sound right. Hey, look, it's Jesus's death army. No, something I just said doesn't sound right. So they're polymers, right? So what that basically typically means is that you take a very small molecule, right, like vinyl chloride, which is literally 2 carbons, 3 hydrogens, and a chlorine, right? And then you strip one.
I'm sorry, can we just have a quick aside?
Yeah.
Vinyl is just carbon?
Yeah.
That's it. Is it naturally occurring?
Well, so vinyl actually it refers to a functional group. So yeah.
Okay, you know what? I think we just found a whole other episode to do. So please go on.
Yeah. So vinyl. So it's kind of like vinyl is the same thing as saying like all. So for example, ethanol, methanol, propanol, right? Or ane, methane, ethane, propane, butane.
Yeah.
All of those
are all groups.
Yeah. So like those, what that word on the back end is kind of giving you a hint at is what does the molecule look like, right? So and actually for like butane, right? But tells you something and ane tells you a different thing. So just with that name, I could draw you what that looks like, right? It's when you get into like the 1,5-all 3-diol 2 ethanol, and you're like, oh my God, you know, like
stop adding suffixes.
Yeah, where it's like methyl, ethyl, amino, phenol, and you're like, oh, good. You're like, I don't know, man. Can I see the picture? I can't. I don't know. So, but yeah, so vinyl chloride, yes, it is. It's what that's saying is that you got a carbon double bonded to a carbon, and vinyl means that it's just whatever the next thing you're about to say is hanging off of that, you know. So in this case, vinyl chloride just means that you have a chlorine on the end. And so then vinyl chloride actually by itself is like horribly carcinogenous, you know?
It sounded carcinogenic. Like just something about that. I was like, that sounds like something you would use in a war crime. Like that does not sound
absolutely
good.
Yeah, you absolutely could. And it's a gas, and actually, it's one of the gases that I, cut my teeth on looking for in environmental chemistry. It is a very regulated. I think the action limit for some cases is 1 part per billion.
Action limit here meaning the amount that will harm you.
The amount to where you have to do something about it, because yes, it would.
Oh, you have to take an action because this is a harmful amount. Got
yeah.
it.
Like so like if you get your test back and it says you've got greater than 1 part per billion of vinyl chloride, something needs to be done. You know? And just for the record, you're allowed 15 parts per billion of arsenic in your drinking water before before you hit the action limit. So but you're 1 part per billion vinyl chloride, you know? So if you want to just for a frame of reference. But once you polymerize it, right, you come up with polyvinyl chloride, or by its more common name, do you know that?
Plastic.
PVC.
Oh, God, it's right there. It does exactly what it says on the tin.
PVC, or polyvinyl chloride, you know?
Yeah.
So very common plastic that we use. I mean, we'll run water through it, you know, run drinking water through it.
I think I have some in this room right now.
Exactly, right? You know, it's like, oh yeah, just get some PVC pipe and, you know, do a thing with it, right? Yeah. So basically that's the polymerization process, right? So here's the thing is if all of a sudden I were to toss you 3 different pieces of plastic, and so again, like you got like polyvinyl chloride, polypropylene, polyethylene, polyethylene glycol, like all of those are like the root molecule and they all start with poly, right? You know? So if I were to suddenly, you know, toss you 3 pieces of plastic, how would you know what the root molecule is on that? Like, is it
Lord.
like what type of plastic it is?
Yeah. I would think probably something to do with the performance characteristics. So like
Sure.
if it's more malleable, depending on how it mars or how it fails, would probably tell me something about the chemical makeup of it.
Yep, absolutely. And you know, melting point is always a good one, you know, because typically things that are very uniform melt at a very specific temperature, which I always thought was kind of cool.
And just to be clear, we are not condoning anyone go melt plastic to see what it's made out of. Yes?
No, definitely
Okay.
not. Yeah. No, 1, definitely don't do that. And 2, if you ever do anything that is remotely related to something like that, at a minimum, write it down, because if you don't write it down, you're just screwing around. But no, don't go melt plastic. It because of the fumes is bad for you, right? But like with most things that are purely uniform, they will melt at a very specific temperature. So like it will be solid and then just it'll hit that temperature and then stay at that temperature and just liquid and then start heating up again, right? Because it just like ice, right? I say all that though to say that if I tossed you those same 3 pieces of plastic and said you have 0.5 seconds to sort each one of them into their root, what they are, right? Could you do it?
No, I don't think that I could.
And in fact, most people can't, because if they can, then they don't tend to work at places that necessitate that skill set. That's part of the problem, right? Is that it's really difficult to determine which plastics are which ones, and it matters because they are completely different chemically, you know? So basically if you're trying to then reclaim PVC, right? So it was in one form, you could melt it down and then put it into a new form. But if you've got PVC and polyethylene glycol in the same mix, now everything's screwed because you don't have a uniform plastic anymore. It is very much so the equivalent of you and me beaming down to the surface and then kind of just mixing it all together, right? Like we wouldn't function as well, you know? So anyway, so that's one of the big problems, right? Is that, you know, you really need to, so one is that most of the plastics are just contaminated on their face because, you know, most people don't completely rinse out or you know, clean all their plastics before they go to the rendering plant and then or to the recycling facility. And then once they get there, you know, it really matters which one is which. And if you're sorting that sort of stuff, to your point, everything that you listed of like, oh, well, it's pliability, it's this, it's that. Yeah, there are a number of different ways you could do that, but there's no automated way to tell that very quickly or easily. And the human way is not much better, right? So that's a big piece of it, right? Then 2 is that different manufacturers will use different additives to kind of like stabilize or give it more pliability or less pliability, right?
So
and now
it's not a uniform pure chemical. It's got secret ingredients.
It does. And you know, they're totally allowed to do that, right? And so then if all of a sudden, again, you know, like even if it's Lions and, you know, Lions' twin brother, right? Even if we beam you down to the surface and scramble your DNA and memories and stuff, it's like, well, you still didn't give me Lions and Lions' twin brother. You gave me a weird amalgam, which doesn't work very well, right? So additives and ratios, that causes a huge issue as well. and then finally is that all of those like chemicals. So, like I said, they're all, as you noted, they're all organics, right? What's another thing that we do famously with organic compounds that we use to get from point A to point B?
Oh, we burn them.
We do burn them, right? We burn them famously. We burn them. We burn them all of the time at great detriment to ourselves, our health, and the environment. So the problem is that a lot of these polymers, right, is that if you do melt them down, the bonds break, right? So now you don't have like a brand new, nice, 50, 100 chain polymer. It's like, let's say it started off with 100 on average, 100 chain polymer, right? And that's what you want. You add your special sauce, and then you're good. You're off to the races, right? Well, you cook it once. Now it's like an 80 chain or 50 chain or a 20 chain, and each time you cook it, the chain gets smaller and smaller to the point where now you don't even have the original like vinyl chloride anymore, right? Which you could then polymerize, right? Is you got this like weird goop of like 5 chains, 10 chains, 20 chains. It becomes this like gross plasticky mess, so it's definitely possible. It's something that can be done, but it's so labor intensive that then you start to get into the economics of it. Is the main reason why people use plastics is because they're cheap.
So I'm wondering, I'm not at all surprised to find out it really is almost, if not entirely, purely economics because America. But I'm thinking about what you just said about like when you reduced it, you're trying to reduce it down, right? So I have a plastic toy. Let's pretend it's uniform, right? It's all made of the same plastic, and I want to melt it so I can make a new toy. If I had a metal figure and I melt it, it sounds like there is a smaller distance between what it takes to melt plastics and what it takes to ruin them versus what it takes to melt metal and what it takes to ruin it. Like, is that accurate?
Yes, actually. So interestingly, and this is one of the things that I really enjoy, and this is that what you listed is absolutely an apt analogy. Metals and plastics are so far apart from one another. like you're like, so these two things are different, right? It's like, yes, oh, that's right, but not a chemist, right? So yeah, so no, actually that's a very, very salient point, right? So the issue, so as far as melting a metal down and ruining it, you can't, because it's all just a metal is on the periodic table, right? So it's iron.
Right. There's reducing it to anything below what it is would be called a nuclear explosion.
Correct. Yeah. If you broke iron, you've got like a whole different set of problems on your hands.
And very hot solutions. Fire.
Yeah. Like if you split iron by like putting it in the oven, it'd be like, save that oven because the sun can't do that. It just made me think of Bart when he shakes up the beer can,
April Fool.
Yeah, exactly. But the problem with plastics is that it's not carbon, right? It's not just, like you could melt down carbon and then pull it back together and you could make it form graphite or, diamond or whatever. With enough heat, enough energy, you can rearrange the carbon to make other carbon. The problem is that with these, it's specifically the way that it's bonded. And more importantly is that, like I said, with polyvinyl chloride is that, again, like you want these nice uniform chains. So when you melt it down, you're getting like chains of varying length, And so worst case scenario, if you could theoretically melt it down so that way you melt it back down into its constituent of like propylene glycol. But that would never happen, right? So then the problem is once you heat it to a certain point, right, is that you're going to start to combust it. And so then all of a sudden you're going to end up with carbon dioxide and this smelly awfulness, So, so your point is absolutely correct, which is that threading the needle between, and this is where I'm a little shaky, but I believe because of the additional additives and of course the fact that it's not always uniform, but even if it was uniform, that there is, even if you were to heat it right to its melting point, is that amount of heat would potentially still break it down in odd and unpredictable ways, So again, plastics are like this is going to be a little gross, but plastics are like tissues. You know, every time you use it, it gets a little bit more messed up
Yeah.
to the point where you can't use that tissue no more.
Yeah. There's you can't save it.
Yeah. Yep. At some point, you're just like, all right, I just need another tissue. And one of the issues too, not to opine too much about the economics, but like that really becomes problematic is that we've now built a whole lot of stuff around the idea that plastic is this like cheap kind of solve all, you know? So like when you say, oh, well, I'm going to use, reusable bags instead of plastic bags, like that is on its face good, except for the amount of carbon emissions that it takes to make the bag, I think supersedes the plastic bag by about 500-fold. So,
yeah, and a lot of them also have like a coating that means that bag also will not like naturally decompose. It may not be plastic. It is a different thing. It has the exact same like ecological problems.
Yeah, and honestly, like plastic is just so ubiquitous, you know, like you just kind of look around and to your point, like things that aren't necessarily plastic might be coated in plastic and all this sort of stuff. So it's kind of I think that Kyrgyzstan did a great exemplar of it, which is that this is like plastic is gold and we are King Midas. And you know, this is an amazing thing, and now everything that we've touched is becoming problematic, you know?
That's gross. And also, that reminds me of another thing I wanted to ask you about.